Some choices seem harmless. You open the fridge, grab yesterday's plate of food, heat it up, and eat. Simple, practical, every day. But what if this very common gesture hides a risk no one is telling you about? The danger sometimes is on the right plate, in the wrong way. And the scariest part is there's no bad smell, no strange taste. No warning, no alert. Just a habit repeated year after year, silently. In this episode, we're going to open a discreet but essential door into your kitchen. We're not going to talk about diets or ultra-processed foods. We're going to talk about what you consider safe and maybe never questioned. Behind 5 very popular foods, there is a sequence of invisible events that may be compromising your health without you realizing it. Maybe that stomach discomfort wasn't stress. Maybe that lack of energy had another origin. Maybe what you lovingly reuse is actually turning into something else. This episode is not about fear, it's about awakening. Because not everything that feeds you does you good. And understanding that could be the turning point for a new way of relating to food. So welcome to another episode of 𝙘𝙤𝙨, where you'll discover 5 common foods that are dangerous if reheated. And more than that, you'll get first-hand fundamental answers for maintaining your health from one of the most respected doctors. Dr. Tanaka, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. And from what I understood, today's conversation is going to shake up very common, almost automatic habits we all have every day. Those simple gestures seem harmless, but might be harming us without us noticing. What exactly is behind this idea?
It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, what I want to bring today is something few people imagine. Sometimes, the biggest risks to our health are disguised in what feels most familiar. The things we repeat every day, without questioning. Imagine, for example, that a simple plate of food saved carefully for the next day could, in fact, be carrying something harmful. I'm not talking about expired or undercooked food. I'm talking about something more subtle and more dangerous.
Now I'm curious. Because it's true, we tend to think the danger is in outside food, processed food, or poorly stored meals. But you're suggesting that even that homemade dish, if not handled properly, can become a trap?
Exactly. What fascinates me and worries me is that these risks aren't obvious. They don't have smell, taste, or strange appearance. Many times, they're hidden in processes we consider normal: storing in the fridge, reheating in the microwave, eating for lunch what was left from dinner. Small decisions we make on autopilot, but that over time may impact our body in subtle and cumulative ways.
It's interesting how routine shapes our eating habits, right? The rush of daily life makes us value practicality above all else. And what looks like a smart choice, like reusing food, can end up backfiring.
No doubt. And it's important to make it clear, we're not demonizing the act of reusing food. Food sustainability is essential, but there are right and wrong ways to do it. Some foods, when reheated, go through chemical changes that can harm our digestive system, trigger toxic reactions, or even accumulate harmful substances over time.
And that can pass completely unnoticed, right? Because we eat, feel fine, and move on. But the body feels it, even if we don't notice immediately. It's almost like a silent, progressive poisoning.
Perfect. It's like the body is a filter. It can handle a lot, but not everything. And what's most dangerous? Many of these reactions don't show up with clear symptoms right after the meal. They build up, slowly wearing down our health, especially in people with weaker immunity, like the elderly or children.
So today's episode is almost like a warning, an invitation to pay more attention to those little daily gestures. What seems safe maybe isn't so much. And who knows, with the right information, we can avoid a series of problems.
Exactly. Today we're going to open our eyes to something hidden in plain sight. Small choices we make in the kitchen that may reflect deeply on our health. And the most interesting part, some of these choices are linked to 5 specific foods that look harmless, but aren't.
Dr. Tanaka, before we get into the foods themselves, I think it's important to reinforce a point that many people might overlook. It's not only about what we eat, but about what we do with the food after it's prepared. And that touches on a habit so ingrained it feels innocent, storing leftovers in the fridge and heating them up later.
That's a central point. Most people believe that by putting food in the fridge, they're automatically protecting themselves. And in fact, Refrigeration is an important step in preservation. But the problem begins when this practice becomes routine without the necessary care. There's a big difference between storing food correctly and just putting a plate in the fridge, hoping it'll last another day.
And when we reheat, that becomes a second critical step, right? Maybe even more important than storage, because that's when the chemical changes you mentioned earlier come into play.
Yes. Heating isn't just a mechanical process to make food warm again. It's a chemical reaction that, depending on the food, can significantly alter its properties. In some cases, it breaks down essential nutrients. In others, it activates toxic substances that weren't there before. Or worse, if the food wasn't well stored, it may already be contaminated, and poor reheating won't be enough to eliminate the microorganisms present.
So we're not talking exaggeration or some unfounded fear. These are real reactions already observed and proven by science. And even so, they remain invisible to most people. That's worrying, because what's invisible is often ignored.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why this subject needs more attention. Imagine this. You believe you're doing something right by reusing a meal, when in fact you may be exposing yourself to serious risks, especially in the long term. And the worst part is that these effects are often cumulative. A bit of indigestion here, a digestive problem there, and after months, the body starts showing stronger signs of overload.
And it's interesting how, culturally, we see storing and reheating as a sign of responsibility, even of economy. But maybe it's time to change that perception and understand that food safety also means knowing what should or shouldn't be reused.
No doubt. It's not about wasting, it's about making smart choices. Knowing which foods tolerate reheating better, how to store them correctly, and most importantly, which ones we should avoid reheating altogether. That can make all the difference in consistently protecting our health.
So here's our first big alert of the episode. Not everything that goes on the plate is safe to eat, even if it comes from your own fridge. The problem is often in what comes after cooking. Dr. Tanaka, what stands out to me is that this habit of saving food for later is, in fact, a universal custom. No matter the continent, culture, or language, almost everywhere in the world people cook more than they consume and save the rest for the next day. It's almost like a silent tradition of modern life.
You're absolutely right. It's a behavior that transcends borders. Whether in a home in Japan, France, or the United States, keeping leftovers in the fridge and reheating them later is part of the daily routine of millions of families. And there are good reasons for that. Economy, practicality, reducing waste. The problem isn't the habit itself, but the lack of knowledge about its limits.
And maybe because it's so common, it's seen as completely safe, right? Almost no one questions it. A person opens the fridge, grabs yesterday's container, pops it in the microwave, and done, lunch is ready. But does every food really behave well in this cycle of refrigeration and reheating?
That's the right question. And the answer is no, not all foods tolerate this process well. Some are more stable and safe. Others, depending on temperature, how long they stayed out of the fridge before being stored, and how they're reheated, can become vehicles for bacteria, toxins, or harmful compounds.
And all of that happens with no bad smell, no strange taste, no visible clue. That's what makes the subject so delicate. The absence of visible signs doesn't mean the absence of danger. The food may look perfectly normal, but it isn't.
Exactly. The food may have been stored in an airtight container at the right temperature. But if it stayed too long at room temperature before going into the fridge, or if it was only half reheated, you're opening a door for the multiplication of dangerous microorganisms. Some of them, like Bacillus cereus, are particularly resistant and can survive the initial cooking.
That also makes me think there's a certain romanticization around next-day food. Some people even prefer the flavor the day after when the seasonings have settled. But that resting isn't always a synonym for safety.
True. In many traditional dishes, like soups, stews, or pasta, there's that perception that flavor improves over time. And in fact, it can. But what may also be happening is an increase in bacterial load if the food wasn't stored properly. It's a double-edged sword. the pleasure of flavor comes with a silent risk.
So what looks like an act of care, saving food so it's not wasted, serving it later, needs to be reevaluated with a more technical and preventive eye. The affection is still valid, but needs to come with knowledge.
Exactly. Tradition and affection don't need to be abandoned. But when it comes to health, tradition must walk alongside science. And understanding the limits of what can or cannot be reused is an essential step to keep this practice safe, for us and for those we love. What makes this subject even more urgent is the fact that the dangers are not visible to the naked eye. When food is spoiled, most people can notice it. The smell changes, the texture alters, the taste gives it away. But when we're talking about reheating certain foods, the risk is chemical and silent. And many times, the appearance stays exactly the same.
And that's the scariest part, right? Because we trust our senses. If the food smells good, looks fine, feels warm, then we assume it's all good. But the body might actually be receiving something completely different than what we imagine.
Exactly. Some foods, when reheated, go through chemical transformations that can release toxic substances or create ideal environments for the multiplication of resistant bacteria. This is particularly critical in foods rich in starch, animal protein, or vegetables high in nitrates. Heat modifies molecular structures and, in some cases, those new structures are toxic or difficult to digest.
And the most dangerous part is that these effects are often not immediate, right? A person can eat, feel fine at that moment, but the body is accumulating these small aggressions over time.
Correct. And in certain cases, the body even reacts right after the meal. Mild abdominal discomfort, gas, nausea. But since those are common symptoms, nobody ties them directly to the act of reheating that food. Then the cycle repeats, day after day. And over time, the digestive system, the liver, the kidneys start absorbing this continuous impact.
And this also raises another issue. The problem isn't just microbiological, it's also chemical. Sometimes the villain isn't even a bacterium, but a new compound that formed with the heat.
Exactly. A good example is nitrates present in vegetables like spinach. At room temperature, and then with reheating, those nitrates can convert into nitrites, compounds that, in excess, can be harmful to health, especially for small children. Another case is proteins that, when reheated, undergo denaturation that compromises digestibility and can trigger adverse reactions.
So we're dealing with a sophisticated enemy, so to speak. It doesn't stink, it doesn't change the look of the dish, and it disguises itself inside foods that, up until yesterday, were considered healthy.
That's exactly it. This is the invisible danger. It hides inside routine, in the trust we have in our habits. And the problem isn't just individual. When the same family repeats these patterns for years, entire generations may be exposed to risks that are silent, but consistent.
It's like modern kitchens need a consciousness update. It's not enough to know what's healthy. You also need to know what stays healthy after it goes through the microwave. Because what we lovingly reuse might actually, unknowingly, be harming us.
And that's the awareness we want to awaken today. To understand that safe eating isn't only about freshness, it's also about knowledge of thermal processes and their consequences. And in the next chapters, we'll see practical examples of how this happens with foods all of us have at home.
Dr. Tanaka, what impresses me is that despite all these risks, we rarely hear about cases of food poisoning linked to reheated meals. Is that because the symptoms are mild, or because we don't even notice where they come from?
Actually, both. Many cases of stomach discomfort, mild nausea, or even diarrhea are attributed to something I ate, but without ever identifying the real culprit. Most people don't connect the discomfort to a homemade dish that was kept in the fridge and then reheated. There's a common belief that whatever comes from our own kitchen is automatically safe. But in practice, it's not that simple.
And have you actually treated patients with this kind of issue?
Yes, quite often. In clinics and hospitals, it's very common to see people with gastrointestinal symptoms that appear hours after an apparently harmless meal. When we investigate, we find patterns: dishes that stayed out of the fridge for too long before being stored, inadequate reheating, or foods that had already been reheated more than once. In one specific case, a patient developed a severe intestinal infection after eating a portion of rice that had been stored for 2 days and quickly reheated in the microwave.
And rice, for example, seems so neutral, right? We never think it could cause something serious. That shows how our perception of risk is a bit distorted.
It's true. And there are also cases where the intoxication is mistaken for something else. Poorly reheated food can cause fatigue, headache, low energy, and the person thinks it's stress or that they didn't sleep well. But the body is actually reacting to a mild toxic overload.
In other words, the problem is real, but it's silent, diluted into daily life. Nobody suspects that chicken from dinner or that potato from lunch. They just blame their stomach or bad luck.
Exactly. And that's why reports get lost. There isn't an immediate alarm, like with clearly spoiled food. Reheated food often still looks appetizing, and the damage happens internally, discreetly. The actual number of people affected is much higher than the records show.
That also raises a collective concern. How many families every single day are serving meals with good intentions, but without knowing they're putting their own health at risk?
It's a serious issue, and it's worth remembering that symptoms aren't always mild. In more vulnerable populations, like the elderly, small children, or people with compromised immune systems, the consequences can be much more severe, including serious dehydration and hospitalizations.
So even before revealing which foods are the most dangerous in this process, it's already clear that the problem is real, underestimated, and widespread around the world. The next step is diving into the science behind it, right?
Exactly. Now we'll understand what actually happens inside food when it's exposed to repeated heat, and why that can represent such a big risk. Now that we understand the context, it's worth diving a little deeper into what science says. When food is heated for the first time, it goes through a series of transformations. Enzymes are inactivated, microorganisms are eliminated, and certain nutrients begin to change. But when that same food is reheated, those transformations continue, and not always in a good way.
So the heat doesn't stop working just because the food was cooked once. It keeps interfering with the food structure every time we heat again. And what exactly changes?
One of the most common changes happens in proteins. With reheating, amino acid chains can undergo further denaturation, making those proteins harder to digest and less bioavailable. In other words, your body can't make use of the nutrients in the same way, and in some cases, it can even cause irritation in the digestive tract.
And what about vegetables? Because we always hear that heat can destroy vitamins, but when we reheat, does that effect get stronger?
Yes, especially in the case of water-soluble vitamins like vitamin C and some B vitamins. They're very heat-sensitive, and reheating can destroy what little remained after the first cooking. Also, some nitrate-rich vegetables like spinach or beets can convert those compounds into nitrites during reheating, substances that, in large amounts, can be potentially toxic.
So it's not just about losing nutrients. You can actually turn something healthy into something harmful with just a simple second heating. That's really alarming.
That's a key point. Another important factor is lipids, that is, fats. Certain types of fat, especially unsaturated fats, can oxidize when repeatedly exposed to heat. That can lead to the formation of compounds like free radicals, which are linked to cellular aging and chronic inflammatory processes.
So we're talking about a deep biochemical transformation, something the human eye can't see, but with real, measurable consequences in the body.
Exactly. And there's also one more aspect that few people know about. Poorly handled leftovers can encourage the growth of spore-forming bacteria. These are microorganisms that can survive the initial cooking and then multiply again when the food is stored improperly. Even if the food is heated later, some of the toxins produced by those bacteria are not destroyed by heat.
This really changes how we see daily kitchen routines. Heating up food isn't just warming it, it's reactivating processes, many of them invisible and even dangerous.
Perfect. That's why we can't rely only on taste or smell. Food might look safe, but the risks are often hidden in what was altered internally. And most importantly, those risks vary depending on the type of food. Some are more sensitive than others, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about next.
Dr. Tanaka, after everything you've explained, I can't help but wonder. Shouldn't the habit of reheating certain foods be placed on the same level of warning as other behaviors we already know are harmful? Like reusing frying oil, overdoing salt, or even consuming too much sugar?
You hit a key point. The problem is that improper reheating still hasn't made it onto the list of everyday villains. Maybe because it's so common and socially accepted, people don't see it as harmful. But from a physiological point of view, the damage can be just as serious as other food habits we already know are bad.
That's curious, because when someone says they're eating at home, cooking their own food, that usually carries a sense of safety, like they're doing the right thing. But as we've seen, that's not always the case.
No doubt. A lot of people believe that simply cooking at home protects them from all risks. And yes, in many ways, it is healthier than eating out often. But when leftovers are reused without care, the effect can be just as harmful as fried foods cooked in old oil, which we already know are linked to inflammation, cell oxidation, and even cardiovascular risks.
And there's something that intrigues me. You mentioned that some toxins created during reheating aren't eliminated even with more heat. That reminds me of those substances formed in overheated oils like acrolein. Is it fair to make that comparison?
Yes, and it's an excellent example. Acrolein, for instance, is a toxic compound that appears when oil is heated repeatedly. It has inflammatory potential, irritates the respiratory tract, and is associated with several disorders. Now imagine similar, lesser-known compounds forming inside a plate of rice or chicken when they're reheated a second or third time. The body reacts to those substances in a similar way, with inflammation, oxidative stress, digestive strain.
So the risk is doubled. We have the false sense of security because it's homemade food, and at the same time we're exposing ourselves to a level of toxicity we can't even see.
Exactly. The invisibility of the problem is what makes it so insidious. If the food smelled bad or looked strange, we'd avoid it. But when everything seems normal, we let our guard down. And that's exactly where the danger lies.
So what you're saying is that we should treat the act of reheating certain foods with the same caution we already have when deciding not to reuse frying oil, meaning as a legitimate and avoidable risk factor.
Exactly. It's not about living in fear, but about living with awareness, and knowing that what seems like a practical, harmless gesture, heating up yesterday's food, can have a biological cost, especially if it's done repeatedly and without proper care.
Dr. Tanaka, so far we have talked about the risks in general, but I imagine that certain groups of the population suffer even more from the effects of these reheated foods. I mean mainly the elderly and small children. Am I right?
Completely right. These two groups deserve doubled attention. The digestive system of a small child is still in development, with a more sensitive gut flora and less resistance to external agents. In the case of the elderly, the body naturally starts to have slower digestion, lower stomach acidity, and, in many cases, the immune system is already weaker.
So, what for a healthy adult could cause just a mild discomfort, for these groups it could mean a real clinical condition. Intense diarrhea, for example, can lead to dehydration in just a few hours in a child.
Exactly. I have seen cases where a simple portion of reheated rice, contaminated with bacteria like Bacillus cereus, caused episodes of vomiting and intense diarrhea in a 3-year-old child. At the hospital, she needed intravenous hydration and 2 days of monitoring. This is the kind of problem that could have been easily avoided with proper handling of food.
And in the case of the elderly, the situation is also delicate, right? Because many live alone or with reduced mobility, and they end up choosing to prepare large amounts of food and eat the same dish for several days.
Yes, that is reality in many countries. The elderly look for practicality, which is understandable. But when they keep food for too long or reheat it more than once, They are exposing themselves to significant risk, especially if they are taking medications that affect gut flora or liver function. The body has less capacity to neutralize toxins and to deal with invading microorganisms.
So it is necessary to make a clear warning here. Not everybody is able to deal with these chemical or microbial changes caused by reheating. And when we're talking about children or the elderly, the care has to be doubled.
No doubt. For children, the ideal is that food is prepared and consumed at the time, whenever possible. And for the elderly, the guideline is to freeze individual portions, which can be defrosted and heated only once, at the right and uniform temperature. This helps to maintain food safety and avoids excessive reuse.
So it's not about forbidding reuse, but about educating people on the right way to do it, especially when we are caring for people in situations of greater physical fragility.
Exactly. With small adjustments in routine, it is possible to maintain the habit of reusing without putting anyone at risk. But that requires knowledge, attention to detail, and, above all, empathy for those who are more vulnerable.
Dr. Tanaka, at this point in the episode, I think most people are already seriously rethinking the way they deal with leftovers in the fridge. And you mentioned back at the beginning that there are 5 specific foods, very common ones, that deserve special attention. 5 items that, although they seem harmless, can hide significant risks when reheated. Can we start to reveal this list?
Of course. And the most impressive thing is that these foods are present in practically every kitchen in the world. They are ingredients that carry high cultural and nutritional value, but that, when they go through certain reheating processes, can undergo changes that compromise health.
And that makes the warning even more necessary, right? Because we are not talking about exotic or highly processed foods. We are talking about things that are part of daily life, Sunday lunch, the work lunchbox.
Exactly. And that is why the impact can be so big. The 5 foods that we are going to address next are potato, rice, chicken, spinach, and boiled egg. Each one of them presents different risks, but they all have something in common. When they are reheated in the wrong way, they can generate harmful chemical or microbiological reactions.
The list already starts with surprise. Potato, spinach, 2 ingredients that we normally associate with health and that are present in diets all over the world. And even so, they can be dangerous?
Yes, and that is where the trap is. The healthy reputation of a food does not protect it from the effects of heat. For example, potato can develop toxic compounds when poorly stored and then reheated. Spinach, as we said before, has a high nitrate content that converts into nitrites. Rice and chicken are champions of contamination if not stored carefully. And boiled egg, when reheated, can release sulfur and oxidize its fats.
That's impressive. And the most curious thing is that these foods are widely reused. How many times does someone save a piece of chicken, heat up a potato from the day before, or put a little rice in the microwave without a second thought? That's more common than one might think.
Definitely. And in many cases, this practice is done with good intention, avoiding waste, saving time, taking care of nutrition. But when you don't know how each food behaves when exposed to heat, the gesture turns into a risk, silent but constant.
So the idea now is to explore each of these foods separately, to understand what exactly happens with them, why they represent a risk when reheated, and what we can do to avoid these negative effects.
Exactly. We are going to analyze each one calmly, in an accessible and practical way, because the goal is not to scare anyone, it's to inform. When you understand the why, it's much easier to change the how, and then your kitchen continues being a space of nutrition, but also of prevention.
Dr. Tanaka, we start the list with a food that is almost unanimous in the whole world, the potato. It is present in every culture, in different forms, boiled, baked, mashed, fried, and is also one of the most reused. But what exactly is the danger of reheating potatoes?
The potato is a fascinating food from the nutritional and historical point of view. Rich in complex carbohydrates, fibers, B vitamins, potassium, but it is also sensitive to certain processes. When it is cooked and left at room temperature for too long, it can start to develop a substance called solanine, and the problem gets worse if it is reheated after that.
Solanine? That name isn't very familiar. What exactly does it do in the body?
Solanine is a natural alkaloid, present in small amounts in vegetables of the nightshade family, like potatoes, tomatoes, and eggplants. At low levels, it usually does not cause problems. But when the potato is stored incorrectly, especially if it starts sprouting or turning green, the concentration of solanine can rise. And if that potato is reheated, the compound becomes even more stable and can cause toxic effects.
And what are the symptoms it can cause?
They go from mild gastrointestinal symptoms, like nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain, to neurological reactions, like dizziness and mental confusion, in more severe cases. Solanine intoxication is not common, but it is also not rare, especially when there is frequent consumption of potatoes reused improperly.
And that is not all, right? Because besides solanine, there is also the microbiological risk, especially if the potato was turned into mashed potatoes or mixed with cream, butter, milk.
Exactly. When you add ingredients rich in fat or protein, the potato becomes even more susceptible to bacterial contamination if it is not refrigerated correctly. And since mashed potato is dense, it can heat unevenly, especially in the microwave, leaving warm spots where bacteria can survive.
So that classic practice of saving mashed potatoes for dinner or the next day needs to be done very carefully. Otherwise, it's a dish ready for stomach ache or something worse.
Yes. The ideal, if you want to reuse potatoes, is to follow some recommendations. Cool them quickly after preparation, store them in a tightly closed container, and reheat them completely until the whole portion is evenly hot. And more importantly, never eat potatoes with sprouts or green parts.
And of course, if the potato stayed out of the fridge for more than 2 hours, it's better not to risk it. Sometimes, throwing it away is the safest thing to do.
Exactly. Health is in the details. With potatoes, the danger is not in the taste or the smell, it's in what happens internally. And as we will see, it is not the only disguised villain on the plate.
Dr. Tanaka, if there is a food that accompanies millions of people in the world every day, it is rice. It is a staple in several continents, often served more than once a day. And it is also common to reuse that rice from lunch or from the night before. But it appears in your list for a good reason, right?
Without a doubt. Rice is a versatile, nutritious food, rich in complex carbohydrates and easy to digest when it is fresh. But it is also one of the most sensitive foods when it comes to storage and reheating. That's because it is a fertile ground for a bacterium called Bacillus cereus, which can survive the initial cooking and multiply quickly if the rice is not stored properly.
So you're saying that even after being cooked, rice can still contain live bacteria? That is surprising because we always imagine that heat kills everything.
That's one of the big traps. Bacillus cereus is a spore-forming bacterium, which means it creates a kind of protective capsule that resists heat. When cooked rice is left at room temperature for too long, these spores germinate and start to multiply. Even if you reheat it later, the toxins already produced by this bacterium can resist heat.
And what are the symptoms of this contamination?
In general, nausea, vomiting, abdominal cramps, and diarrhea. The symptoms appear quickly, between 1 to 5 hours after ingestion. It usually isn't serious in healthy adults, but it can be dangerous in children, elderly people, and those with weakened immunity. The problem is that most people never suspect rice.
That's true. Rice is practically synonymous with simple and light food, and that's why nobody puts it in the dangerous food category. But it seems that it can be a silent time bomb.
Yes, and the risk increases in places where large quantities of rice are cooked and reused, like in lunchboxes, restaurants, or home kitchens that prepare everything at once. If cooked rice is not refrigerated within 2 hours and stored in a tightly sealed container, it can turn into a perfect culture medium for bacteria.
And what about reheating? Heating it well doesn't solve the problem.
Unfortunately, no. Heat can kill the bacteria, but it doesn't destroy the toxins they already produced. That's why the safest recommendation is, If the rice stayed out of the fridge for too long, throw it away. If it was refrigerated properly, heat it well, stirring to make sure the heat spreads evenly.
So the message is clear. Rice may look innocent, but it requires maximum attention, especially because it is so present in daily life that it's easy to underestimate it.
Exactly. Rice is not a villain, but it can turn into a risk when it is mistreated. Knowing this is the first step to keep eating well, but more safely.
Dr. Tanaka, now we arrive at one of the most consumed foods in the world, chicken, a source of lean protein, easy to prepare, cheap, and widely reused, especially in dishes like salads, wraps, pies, soups. But apparently, this reuse can be a problem, right?
Yes, chicken deserves special attention. It is, in fact, an excellent source of animal protein, but it is also highly perishable. The problem with chicken starts with its protein composition. When we heat it the first time, those proteins denature, which is expected. But when they are reheated a second time, especially at high temperatures or unevenly, they can undergo even deeper modifications, making them harder to digest.
So it's not just a matter of bacteria or contamination. It is also a structural alteration that can cause discomfort in the digestive system. And does this happen often?
Much more often than people think. Some people report feeling heaviness in the stomach, gas, reflux, or even cramps after eating reheated chicken, and they rarely make the direct connection with the source of the problem. Besides that, if the chicken was poorly stored, there is a real risk of proliferation of bacteria such as Salmonella or Campylobacter, which are known to cause serious food poisoning.
And how can these bacteria survive if the chicken was already cooked?
They usually do not survive the initial cooking. But if the cooked chicken is left at room temperature for more than 2 hours, there is risk of recontamination or multiplication of remaining bacteria. And the worst, when the chicken is reheated unevenly, like in a microwave or a quick fry, some parts may not reach the right temperature to kill these microorganisms.
So the danger comes from 3 fronts: the modified proteins, possible recontamination, and improper reheating. That's not small.
Exactly. That's why chicken requires doubled care. It should never be left out of the fridge for too long, and if it is reused, it must be reheated completely, preferably in the oven or in a pan, where heat spreads better. Besides that, chicken that has already been heated once should not be reheated again. That means you cannot heat it, eat a piece, store it again, and heat it the next day.
And for those who usually use cooked chicken to prepare weekly lunch boxes, what's the tip?
The best strategy is to divide it into individual portions right after cooking, let it cool outside the fridge for no more than 1 hour, and then refrigerate or freeze immediately. When consuming, take only the necessary portion and heat it once, with uniform temperature. This way, you reduce the risks a lot.
So chicken continues to be a great food, but it needs to be treated with respect. The protein that nourishes can also be the one that causes problems if it is handled carelessly.
Perfect. In the kitchen, the difference between health and risk is in the details. And with chicken, every step matters: preparation, storage, and reheating.
Dr. Tanaka, so far we've been talking about foods that are part of most people's daily lives. But now we're entering interesting territory because we're going to talk about something considered super healthy: spinach. Rich in iron, vitamins, antioxidants, it seems harmless, even noble. But apparently, when it's heated a second time, it also poses risks.
Yes, spinach is a great example of how even healthy foods can change under certain conditions. It is, in fact, packed with nutrients. But it's also high in natural nitrates, compounds that, when exposed to repeated heat, can turn into nitrites and later into nitrosamines, substances that are potentially toxic.
Nitrosamines, that name has already been linked to serious risks, right? Including possible ties to inflammatory processes and even cancer, if I'm not mistaken.
You're absolutely right. Nitrosamines are compounds that have been studied for their possible connection with the development of chronic diseases, including certain types of cancer. They can form from the conversion of nitrites when combined with high temperatures and an acidic environment, such as the stomach. Reheating spinach speeds up this transformation.
So, the intention is great. Someone makes a dish with vegetables, thinking of their health. But if they store it and heat it again the next day, they might be eating something very different from what they originally prepared.
Exactly. And the risk isn't only in the altered chemical composition. Spinach also loses much of its nutrients when it's reheated. Vitamin C, for example, is almost completely destroyed, and the minerals lose their bioavailability. What was once a superfood, with a second heating, turns into a dish that's impoverished and potentially toxic.
And it's common for people to reuse it, right? Many prepare spinach in larger amounts, save it to use in other recipes, heat it up with pasta, rice, omelets, and never imagine that this healthy leftover can turn into a problem.
Yes, and that's why it's important to stress. If you cook spinach, the best thing is to eat it right away. If you need to store it, it's better to use it cold, in salads or spreads. And if you do reheat it, do it only once, and carefully, making sure the temperature is right.
So the lesson here is clear. Not every vegetable handles excessive heat well, especially when it happens more than once. And with spinach, that care should be doubled.
No doubt. Spinach is still a great food, but the way it's handled after cooking is what determines whether it's a health ally or a silent risk.
Dr. Tanaka, now we've reached the last food on our list, and it's another favorite in healthy diets, the boiled egg. A source of protein, cheap, practical, versatile. It's part of diets all around the world. But few people imagine that reheating a boiled egg can have serious side effects.
Yes, eggs are really excellent foods, but like you said, the way they're reused can turn this nutritional powerhouse into a potential risk. When boiled and then reheated, especially in the microwave, eggs go through changes that compromise both digestibility and safety.
And what exactly are these changes? What happens to an egg when it's reheated?
The main issue lies in the egg's chemical composition. The proteins in the white, when heated again, can become denser and harder for the digestive system to break down. This can cause bloating, gas, and even nausea in some people. But the more concerning issue is what happens with the sulfur in the egg.
Sulfur? That's interesting. What does that element have to do with the risk of reheating?
The egg, especially the yolk, contains sulfur compounds that, when exposed to excessive heat a second time, can react and form substances such as hydrogen sulfide. This compound not only has a strong odor, that characteristic smell we often notice, but it can also be toxic in high concentrations, causing gastric irritation and discomfort.
So that strong smell of a reheated egg may be more than just an annoyance. It can be a sign that there's a chemical transformation happening that the body won't like.
Exactly. And beyond that, if the egg wasn't properly refrigerated or was left out too long before being reheated, there's also the risk of bacterial contamination, especially from salmonella. Uneven heating in the microwave, for example, may not eliminate all the bacteria present.
And the curious thing is that eggs, being so practical, end up being used in meal prep, cold salads, quick meals. But maybe the best option is to avoid any reheating and eat them right after cooking or cold, as long as they're well stored.
Exactly. If you want to reuse them, the best way is to slice the egg and eat it cold, in dishes like salads or sandwiches. Reheating should be the last resort, and if it's done, it must be with care and at the proper temperature, but always paying attention to the smell, texture, and storage time.
So here's the final warning from our list. Boiled eggs are great, but they're not meant to go back on the stove twice. Better safe than sorry, and avoid an unpleasant surprise in your body. Dr. Tanaka, after this true journey through the hidden side of reheating food, I think it's worth recapping everything clearly. Because what once seemed like just a routine habit, now it's clear it can hide real health risks, especially if it's done carelessly.
No doubt. And what we've seen so far shows that it's not the food itself that's the problem, but what happens to it after cooking. Storing it wrong, heating it without care, leaving it too long out of the fridge. All of that contributes to chemical and microbiological changes that directly affect the body.
Let's quickly review the 5 foods that deserve the most attention. First, potatoes. When reheated, especially if they were already left out, they can develop 𝘿𝙞𝙨𝙘𝙡𝙀, a natural toxin that affects the digestive and even the nervous system.
Next is rice, one of the trickiest cases. If it's stored while still warm or left too long outside the fridge, it can encourage the growth of Bacillus cereus. Even after reheating, the spores of this bacteria can survive, causing symptoms like vomiting and diarrhea.
Then we have chicken, which seems safe, but when it's reheated, its proteins can change, making digestion harder and even harboring resistant bacteria if the heating isn't uniform. Especially dangerous when it goes straight from the fridge to the microwave.
Then we have spinach, which is very high in nitrates. When reheated a second time, these compounds can turn into nitrites and nitrosamines, which have been linked to inflammatory processes and chronic diseases. A healthy vegetable that must be eaten with care.
And finally, boiled eggs, which, when reheated, can release sulfur compounds such as hydrogen sulfide and also carry the risk of bacterial contamination. Plus, their proteins become denser and harder to digest.
These 5 foods are clear examples of how repeated heat deeply alters the structure of what we eat. There may be nutrient loss, toxin production, higher microbiological risk, all of that in a dish that looks perfectly normal.
And the most important point is that this information isn't meant to scare, but to empower people. Knowing this changes how you deal with your food and your family's health. Because it's not just about what you eat, it's how you eat when you eat and how you reuse it.
Perfect. With small changes in routine, it's possible to keep enjoying food safely and wisely. And that's worth more than any trendy diet. It's health applied in everyday life.
Dr. Tanaka, after so much relevant information, I think what the audience wants most right now are solutions. Because the idea here was never to demonize reheating food, but to show that with small changes in habit, we can turn a risk into safety. So where do we start?
The foundation of it all is one word: temperature. Keep hot foods really hot, and cold foods properly chilled. If you've cooked a meal and know you're going to store the leftovers, the ideal thing is to cool the food down as quickly as possible. Leaving it at room temperature for more than 2 hours already significantly increases the risk of bacterial growth.
So that common habit of leaving the pot covered on the stove for later is already the first mistake, right?
Exactly. The right way is to transfer the food to a clean, shallow container. Let it cool quickly, if possible by setting the container over a tray of ice, and refrigerate it immediately. And the container should be sealed, preferably made of glass or food-safe plastic, without excess moisture.
And when it's time to reheat, what should the audience watch for to make sure they're doing it as safely as possible?
Ideally, the food should reach at least 165 degrees Fahrenheit 74 degrees Celsius in the center, which corresponds to the point where steam is already coming out intensely. In the case of microwaves, it's important to stir the food halfway through the heating time to ensure the heat is distributed evenly. And you should avoid reheating the same dish more than once.
That's another common trap, those leftovers that go back and forth between the fridge and the microwave over 2 or 3 days. It seems practical, but it becomes a cycle of risk, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Reheating food more than once increases the chances of chemical and microbiological alterations. That's why, if you've got something left over that you won't eat right away, the best approach is to separate it into individual portions. That way you only reheat what you'll eat at the moment.
And for people who want to avoid reheating altogether, are there options? Are there foods that can be eaten cold safely?
Yes, many foods can be safely eaten cold. Cooked vegetables, properly stored rice, sliced meats, boiled eggs in salads, as long as they've been well refrigerated and are still within a safe time frame. Sometimes, adapting the recipe is better than insisting on the original dish.
So, the message is simple and powerful. Cooking with awareness doesn't end at the stove. It starts in the preparation and finishes in the way you store and reuse. That's self-care at its most basic and at its deepest too. Dr. Tanaka, what a powerful conversation. We started out talking about such a common habit, reheating food, and ended up diving into a universe of science, prevention, and care. And in the end, what strikes me most is that phrase you mentioned at the start, The danger hides in the details. Because that's exactly it.
And that's what makes this topic so urgent. It's not about turning the kitchen into a laboratory of obsessions, but about bringing awareness to the things we repeat automatically. Many times, it's those everyday gestures, like storing food poorly or reheating it carelessly, that accumulate consequences for our health.
And I keep thinking about how many people right now are listening to this episode while eating the leftovers from last night's dinner, without knowing that that plate, if poorly stored or reheated, might be crying for help without showing any visible sign.
And that's exactly why knowledge is liberating. When you understand what's behind each choice, you gain more autonomy, more respect for your own body, and more care for the people you love. After all, cooking is also an act of responsibility.
And the most beautiful thing is that you don't need to change everything radically. Small adjustments already make a huge difference. Like cooling food quickly, dividing into portions, avoiding reheating certain foods a second time, watching how long it's been in the fridge. Simple decisions that silently protect you.
Perfect. The idea isn't to create fear, but to awaken reflection. Because it's not just what you eat that matters, but how, when, and under what conditions. Quality of life is deeply tied to habits, and few habits are as repeated as those involving food.
So, if we could leave one final message, it would be this: look at your kitchen with new eyes. Maybe the greatest allies of your health are right there, or maybe the small, silent enemies. The difference between one and the other lies in how you act, and in how much you know.
And now you know. And with that knowledge, you can already make better decisions every single day. Health starts behind the scenes, in what nobody sees. And those behind the scenes are between the stove and the fridge.
Dr. Tanaka, thank you so much for this inspiring and thought-provoking conversation. And to you who stayed with us until now, our invitation is simple: reflect, adjust, and take care. Because sometimes the secret to a healthier life is hidden in the simplest gestures of your routine. And if you want to keep receiving the best videos for your health, subscribe to the channel, because it exists for only one reason: to make you a healthier person with better quality of life. Helping you is my mission. In the video that's now on your screen, I reveal the nighttime drink that eliminates sugar from your blood while you sleep deeply. Click on the screen and check it out.